Jamestown who was 6 years old.
But why? And I think that the epic journey is really, I think Joseph Campbell summed it up so well when he said life is the act of becoming. One never arrives, which in its own statement is exploration. We are explorers, but it begins with that vision. It begins with that dream of going out and pushing that horizon. How could the human race sit in a room with a door and never want to open that door?
Well, just earlier tonight, I was standing by a map, and Bob walked up and said, well, I think, with a gleam in his eye that looked and a big smile that looked every bit as much like a kid as I've ever seen, and said, I think the Endeavour is right there. And I think that, you know, the excitement of discovery and exploration is part of it. You have to imagine to get there, and I really think that that's something that we have to make accessible to a lot more people, because we have moved ever so quickly into an era where people are very removed, more than they've ever been statistically, from their surroundings, and at the same time we ask them to make decisions, critical decisions, about science, about biology, about ecology. And really, these are going to come down to individuals. They're going to come down to people who vote, people who don't vote but should, and to politicians who have got to ultimately take this more seriously. But I think that that's our mandate.
All of you go, you're being modest, all of you go to where it's dangerous. All of you show courage, to borrow a notion Dr. Ambrose knows very well. Can people who don't show, what about exploration that doesn't involve courage? You go to the mountaintops, to the desert and war zones, under the ocean. What about exploration for those of us who aren't going to risk our lives?
I think everyone's brave to get in an airplane. I mean,
drive down the highway.
The most dangerous part of my trip is getting to my ship.
You know, danger's landing at D-Day. What we do is frivolous in comparison. I mean,
it's not that dangerous.
I don't think it's dangerous.
Well, I think danger. And in terms of exploring, the working in the lab with the materials that these people send in to them, and studying them, that's exploring. Very much.
But it's really not that dangerous. I mean, we know what we're doing, and we know we're not taking great risks. We're not.
Yeah, I think danger is much in the mind of the beholder. I have, on occasion, lost as much as half a crew of experienced people because their interpretation was the area was too dangerous and our time was too short, just prior to making some big discoveries. And yet, in that area of the Sahara, we invited a Tuareg nomad from the desert who felt that it was safe enough to do what we ultimately did. I invited him to Chicago. And he arrived at the airport, was held up for all sorts of extra searches and everything, and when he came out of the terminal and he saw me and he came walking up to me like this, and he said, if I didn't see you right there, I would have turned around and gone back home. Because he was very frightened of Chicago. And if you look at the why would you be frightened of Chicago? Well, why would you be frightened of any city here? There's plenty of good reason to be frightened of our cities. We learn to live with it. It's in the mind of the beholder, like you say. Getting to your site is actually some of the most difficult and dangerous things. I don't mean to lighten what many of us have done, but in fact, we take for granted the things we must live with. And we put great danger on things that we can only experience very infrequently and don't know very well.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time on that note. I'm scared to go to Chicago. I think it's safe to say that never before has so much courage and intelligence and ability and dedication and inspiration been on stage at the same time at National Geographic. All of us who are associated with National Geographic Society are proud to be associated with all 7 of you. And to paraphrase William Shakespeare, may fiery expeditions be your wings. Thank you. A person in authority has just said 5 minutes of questions, but I will cut it off very impolitely and quickly after the 5 minutes. Yes, sir.
You've all dealt with foreign governments. I mean, in the United States we have, or Western world governments are more or less acceptable, but in some of the areas you've worked in, you deal with chaos and governments that cannot control their populations and get at the problems that you mentioned. How can we increase their awareness of the problems that we've discussed tonight?
I can
Go ahead.
jump right
Go
in.
ahead.
By example, for one thing, you know, the National Geographic was instrumental in helping to cause the national park system to come to be. Some say it's the best idea that America ever had. And perhaps in the next century, millennium or whatever, we will begin to do similar things for the ocean. We have begun with the National Marine Sanctuary Program, but by example is certainly a good place to start. But that's by itself not enough. I think the knowledge and dissemination of knowledge, again, this institution is superb at providing that as an absolutely fundamental base for whatever follows.
Yeah, and I would add to that, you know, danger in general and safety are how you measure it. And we come from a country that is one of the wealthiest in the world, and yet we have death by the thousands every year due to handgun violence or violence of other kinds that we have in our hands the power and certainly the wealth to stop. I work in a country that is one of the poorest in the world, Niger, where they don't have that level of gun violence on average, but they are very poor. They don't have enough money for gasoline to drive around and police their population. I think it's really, and I think that we must come to grips in a country like that. The question is, how do you reach an awareness in a population that is really striving to survive day to day on average, that these creatures, some of which you see out in the lobby, are worth not taking care of for all of humanity, and frankly, we can do it. We're taking some of them back. We're gonna get a museum built, and I think for a reasonable sum of support, we're going to try and develop a system to protect these in that country. But I really think that it is possible to instill a feeling of respect for all the different kinds of things that we explore.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I don't think that politicians lead in the third world any more than they really lead here. I mean, the people lead, and change happens as a process, you know. Trying to be optimistic as Dr. Ambrose was, I mean, if you think about it, 40 years ago, highway beautification was considered a great victory. Just getting people to stop throwing garbage out of car windows was considered the epitome of environmental activism. You know, people like Rachel Carson, who warned of far more dire scenarios, were lone voices in the wild. The poet Gary Snyder, who's one of my heroes, who's really one of the prophets of deep ecology, once told me that he would hitchhike across the country in the 1950s just to have dinner with someone to whom he could relate. You know, we've come so far. Biodiversity, biosphere, these were terms that 40 years ago were the domain of a handful of scientists. Now they're part of the vernacular of school children. So change is happening at a actually rather extraordinary rate. And before we judge the so-called third world too harshly, we should always remember what we did to our own landscape. You know, passenger pigeons once blackened the sky, you know, eclipsing the sun. You know, hardwood forest. There was a time in North America where you could literally practically move coast to coast on top of the forest. Isn't that true? You know.
And let me add to that we've got examples right here at home, and it's beyond the passenger pigeon. The American South, where I live. Think what it was like 40 years ago. And George McGovern was once head of the Food for Peace program, and he had the dean at the University of Georgia call and say he wanted to come see, and George said fine, and the guy came and he said, you know the best thing the federal government ever did for the South? I'm a Yankee by birth, and I would have said won the Civil War, of course. But he said, no, it's a school lunch program. And George said, well, wait a minute, what about Social Security? What about rural free delivery? What about electrification? The guy said, no, it's the school lunch program. And now George is, because the scores went up by 60, 70, 80%, and the attendance went up by 50, 60% when they were offering these free lunches and the kids were being fed. We can do that all over the world. We produce enough food, along with Australia and Argentina and the other exporting countries. And with the Cold War over, we've got enough money. We can feed the whole world school lunches. And then just think what's going to happen in Africa. What's going to happen in the Middle East? What's going to happen in the Muslim countries? What's going to happen in India and Pakistan when we start feeding those kids free school lunches and they start learning? And that's what's going to bring them. It's not for us to teach other people exactly what you just said. We can't teach other people how to do almost anything. We can teach them universal education.
Sorry to do this. We're really out of time. Thank you. For dinner? Dinner's being served in the main dining hall.
That's 8. Yes, that's our lunch.
Great stuff.